Everyone. I'm Mary Pat Higgins. I'm the president and CEO of the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum, and it is such a pleasure tonight to see a full audience for this incredible program, the Funk Family Upstander Speaker Series. The Funk Family Upstander Speaker Series, named in loving memory of Blanche and Max Goldberg and Fanny and Isaac Funk, was created in the spirit of the museum's mission to teach the history of the Holocaust and advance human rights to combat prejudice, hatred, and indifference. In this series, we highlight individuals and organizations who stand up for the rights of others and who see something wrong and work to make it right. I'd like to start by thanking our generous series sponsors, Susser Bank, Catherine and Sam L. Susser, and Match Group, and our event sponsor, Condon, Tobin, Sladek, Thornton, and Nuremberg. Please join me in thanking them. I'd also like to thank our incredible community partners for this event: Big Brothers Big Sisters Lone Star, Denton Black Film Festival, Human Rights Campaign Dallas-Fort Worth, Jewish Family Service of Greater Dallas, Legacy Senior Communities, Mosaic Family Services, St. Philip's School and Community Center, and Temple Shalom. We are so grateful for your partnership and support of our programming. And as always, I'd like to give a warm welcome to our museum members, our board members, and our volunteers. Your support is crucial to helping us fulfill our mission, and we wouldn't be able to put on programs like this without you. If you are not a member or a volunteer, I encourage you to go to our website and consider getting involved. We really could use your support. We need volunteers, and we always need members. So please join us to make sure that we are able to fulfill our mission. Tonight, we are recognizing the work of the Innocence Project, an incredible organization dedicated to restoring freedom for the innocent and transforming systems responsible for unjust incarceration. We are honored to host 3 leaders working to combat wrongful convictions, true upstanders. I want to leave plenty of time for our discussion, so I will introduce each speaker briefly. In 1989, after being coerced into a false confession and pleading guilty to murder, Christopher Ochoa was sentenced to life in prison for a crime he did not commit. Thanks to DNA evidence, he was exonerated in 2001 and later enrolled in law school at the University of Wisconsin, where he worked with the Wisconsin Innocence Project and the Greene County District Attorney's Office. He continues to practice law and regularly gives presentations on interrogation and false confession. Bhavan K. Sodhi is the Chief Program Officer at the Innocence Project. She comes to the Innocence Project with deep experience in innocence work, having served as the legal director of Innocence Canada, the executive director of the Osgood Innocence Project in Toronto, and an adjunct professor at Osgood Hall Law School, teaching wrongful conviction and forensic science. Sodhi also co-founded the Wrongful Conviction Clinic at the University of Toronto Faculty of Law. And Mike Ware, the executive director of the Innocence Project of Texas, right here in North Texas. In 2006, he co-founded the organization as an all-volunteer organization to address wrongful convictions. Shortly after, he became Special Fields Bureau Chief for the Dallas County District Attorney's Office, where he helped establish and was the head of the nation's first Conviction Integrity Unit. The success achieved by the Dallas County CIU under his leadership has made it a model emulated by other district attorneys' offices nationwide. And our moderator tonight is probably familiar to many of you, Rebecca Lopez, Senior Crime and Justice Reporter at WFAA here in Dallas. She joined the station in April of 1998 and has covered the Dallas Police Department since 2003. Over the years, she has broken some of the biggest stories at the Dallas Police Department and covered national stories like the Oklahoma City bombing, the siege at the Branch Davidian compound in Waco, the Space Shuttle Columbia disaster, and the 2016 shooting of 5 Dallas police officers. So as you can see, we have an incredible panel, and I'm anxious to get to them and let them speak to you. But before we start, I wanted to remind you that we'll have time for questions and answers at the conclusion of the program. If you're joining us in person, please use the note cards that we passed out as you entered and write down your questions. Our staff will come and pick them up, and we'll do our best to answer as many as possible. If you're joining us virtually, please use the chat function at the bottom of your screen and submit your questions. And now, it is my pleasure to turn this over to the panel.
Thank you so much. I have covered the Dallas Police Department for many, many years, and almost 25 years here in Dallas covering crime and justice. And I have covered several exonerations, and I know that Dallas has one of the most successful rates when it comes to exonerating innocent men and women in this country. And that is because they saved a lot of the DNA samples in Dallas at the medical examiner's office as well as DPD, and they were very successful in doing that. So with that, they have been able to exonerate so many innocent people and have one of the highest success rates, and I know that Mr. Ware had a lot to do with that. So I am very honored to be here and to give you a chance to ask some questions, but also to hear from these amazing panelists that are doing incredible work and really bringing justice to people that deserve it. So we're going to start with you, Bhavan. Let's start by asking you, could you tell us how and why the Innocence Project was started?
Thanks, Rebecca. The Innocence Project was started in 1992 in New York City. It started off as a legal clinic, strong but mighty, with students. And at that time, there were 5 known DNA exonerations. Fast forward 30 years later, and of the 375 DNA exonerations, the Innocence Project directly represented or in some way assisted with more than half of them. And the Innocence Project in New York City, they have since, both DNA and non-DNA exonerations contributed to 238 cases where individuals have collectively served over 3,600 years wrongfully in prison. And part of the reason that we continue our work is even when looking at conservative estimates, it suggested that 4% of the institutionalized population is wrongly convicted. And even by that account, that accounts for tens and thousands of people. And so there's reason why we continue to do our work.
Wow, that is shocking. That number is really incredible. Mike, if you tell us a little bit about the Texas Innocence Project.
Yes, thank you. In 2006, I was practicing criminal defense in Fort Worth, Texas, and a law school friend and I co-founded the Innocence Project of Texas as a 501c3 nonprofit. And we were affiliated with the National in New York, but we were our own freestanding nonprofit. Then in 2007, Craig Watkins, the first African-American ever to be elected district attorney of Dallas County, or anywhere in Texas for that matter, was elected and was looking to make big changes in Dallas County, which had been notorious for injustices. And so he hired a very good friend of mine, Terry Moore, to be his first assistant, and she came up with the idea of starting a conviction integrity unit. And she asked me to come be the head of leave private practice and come be the head of the conviction integrity unit. And so I did in 2007 and did it for 4 years. And we, during that time, I think we exonerated about 25 men that had been wrongfully convicted in Dallas County. Some of it through DNA, not all of it. Richard Miles was a non-DNA case, completely innocent. And then, and I've got to correct one thing. I think if if Dallas had kept all the DNA, there would have been 4 times that many exonerations. Most of the time, we couldn't find the DNA. But Swifts did do a good job of it, of preserving the DNA. But to move on, I left in 2011 to go back to private practice and rejoin the Innocence Project of Texas. And now I'm the executive director, and we've freed or exonerated, I believe, 27 men and women now, and we have cases all over the state in litigation and investigation right now.
You have 70 organizations across the country that are part of this network. Do y'all work together on cases? Do you cross state lines?
We have, and certainly we, perform courtesy investigations if somebody has a witness that's somewhere in Texas that needs to be found. And we did work on a case in federal court out of South Dakota that involved multi-defendants that we worked with multiple innocence projects with.
Bhavan, you wanted to jump in on that question?
I'd probably add that with policy initiatives, that's where we see the most amount of collaboration, where of the 200 plus policies relating to wrongful convictions that have been passed, the vast majority are done through network partnerships. And so that's an opportunity to work at the state level with other organizations. And then to Mike's point, even in Toronto, where we were also an organization affiliated with the network, we'd often do courtesy investigations if someone had gone across the border. And so given our common cause, I think it's often the case that we'll work together when asked.
Chris, I can't imagine spending 13 years in prison for a crime that you did not commit. Can you talk just a little bit more about your case and how you came to be charged and what happened?
There was in 1988 in Austin, Texas, there was murder and rape, excuse me, and a robbery of a young woman at a Pizza Hut, in a local Pizza Hut in Austin. That case was pretty much, they were looking for the perpetrator that did it, or perpetrators in this instance, but it was really a perpetrator. But at any rate, this Pizza Hut, I used to work at a Pizza Hut in Austin and another Pizza Hut. And this Pizza Hut was closed for the investigation. And when they reopened it, I don't know how long after the crime, when they reopened it, I happened to be, one of my roommates was driving me home in Austin, and driving me home. And he wanted to go to the Pizza Hut where this crime happened. And I reluctantly went along with him. But he wanted, so we went into the Pizza Hut, and he ordered a beer for both of us. And he raised a toast to the victim, the memory of the victim. And shortly afterwards, we left, and apparently my roommate was asking questions of a security guard that the Pizza Hut posted out, at the restaurant. So upon us leaving, apparently Austin law enforcement had told the staff at the Pizza Hut, at that Pizza Hut, and that to be on the lookout, because they thought that whoever committed a crime may come back to the scene. And when the employees when they saw the memory of the toast to the victim, and then my roommate asking questions, it when they saw it prompted them to call law enforcement. And in Austin, and a couple days later, I was picked up on a Friday. The Pizza Hut that I worked at, I was 22 years old at the time. And it was 2 detectives. They wanted to question me on a burglary. They said that a burglary. But I was very young, very naive. They were lying to me. I was already a suspect in that murder. But I went with them to the with law enforcement to the police station, thinking that I would be back to my job. And so they take me to the police station, and they ask me questions about the burglary, not very many, 2 or 3. And then next thing I know, they're walking me to what I know now is the interrogation room, when my nightmare began. That's when those 2 detectives that picked me up left. And then I was in this room, a young kid. I didn't know anything really much. But when they left, I remember a Hispanic detective, walked in. And I remember when he walked in, he looked at me up and down with a menacing stare and slammed his fist on the table and told me that they called him the boogeyman out in the street. And that didn't mean anything to me, but anyway, he proceeded to ask me, yelling. He was not being, professional. He was yelling. He wanted to know what I knew about the murder at the Pizza Hut. I told him I didn't know anything. I didn't know what he was. If I knew, I would tell him, but I didn't know anything. But he kept insisting that I knew something, that if I didn't cooperate with them, that I would be charged with capital murder and I would get the death penalty. At that point, I'm telling him, no, I don't know. I don't know anything. And during this time, I'm a young kid that I was always taught, as a lot of us children are, to trust law enforcement, that they're there to protect us, and I was still under that. But I still would tell him I don't know anything. So he walked out and walks in the good cop. Good cop says, well, my partner's a hothead. Everything we see on TV, playing live. My partner's a hothead. I can, just tell us what you know, and then you can go. Like now, my impression is that I can't leave because, well, I trust law enforcement. But anyway, he says, look, tell us what you know, and you can leave. And I tell him, no, I don't know anything. If I did, I would tell you, but I don't know anything. I don't know anything about that crime. So he leaves the room, and in comes the bad cop again. And he starts, and my interrogation, this was interrogation that started on a Friday. I was there about 9 in the morning. I forget how long I was, but I was there a long time. I don't know the hours. There's no clocks in interrogation rooms. He came in and he started badgering me again. What do you know about this crime? I kept on telling him no. There's a back and forth. Good cop would walk in, and at some point during this interrogation, there was a female Hispanic detective that walked in. And I said, well, in my mind, she's a woman. She should be compassionate. So I asked her, do you think, can I get an attorney? She immediately turned around and said, no, you can't have one until you're officially charged. Well, that's not true, but in my mind, I thought, well, but she walks out, and here comes the detective again. Now he's threatening me. At one point, there was an interrogation to try to get me to I don't know, tell him what he wanted to know, which I didn't have any. But anyway, he grabs my arm, and he taps my arm like, that needle's going to go right here inside your vein if you don't cooperate. And I'm like, at this point now, I'm really getting like, what is going on? I mean, one moment I'm living my life, and the next minute they're saying they're going to kill me. And that's what's going through my mind. So he walks out, the good cop walks in, but the bad cop walks right back in, and now he's got a picture of death row. Says, this is the cell that you're going to live in until they execute you. And you won't be able to hold your family again, or you won't touch another human being until they execute you. But he said he was going to if I didn't cooperate, he was going to make sure he was there when they executed me. And And he left, and I was still insisting I'm innocent, I didn't do anything. And then he walks out, he walks in, and now he brings a picture of the victim, of the autopsy. And then he said, don't you feel bad for her? Don't you want to help her? I said, yeah, but I don't know anything. So, but in that picture, I could see where she was shot in the head, where the bullet went. She walks out, walks in, and I mean, at this point, I'm getting really tired. I just want to go home. But in my mind, I think I can't go home. And then he comes in and he tells me, you know what, I'm getting tired of your BS. If you don't cooperate, you know what, I'm getting tired of, I'm just going to charge you. And he at some point told me he knew I couldn't have done that. He said he couldn't because I had a clean record. He knew I had a clean record. I didn't have, but fast forward to when he walks in, tells me, you know what, I'm just going to charge you. I'm going to throw you in jail. And that's where you're going to be fresh meat for the prisoners. So in there, I thought he meant prison rape. And not only that, I was tired. At that point, I just said, what do you want me to tell you? I just want to go home. And then they gave me, so there was a statement taken. That was the first statement. And the statement simply was that my roommate, who I went, had done it and told me, because they were really after my roommate. They really wanted to get him. And I just repeated whatever he wanted to say. He typed the statement, and I signed it. But that first statement, it was just saying that then my roommate told me. So I thought I could go home. I couldn't go home. The detective said that they're afraid for my life, and I just gave a testimony against another roommate, and they thought he was gonna hurt me, so they put me up at a Holiday Inn in Austin, Texas. And at that point, I'm still believing in these officers. They tell me, don't call anybody, don't talk to anybody, or room service or whatever, and on their dime. But at some point on the next day, on a Saturday, because they took me to the hotel on a Friday night, I call my roommate and I tell him, I think I'm gonna need a lawyer. So on Monday morning, law enforcement picks me up from my hotel room and they tell me, now we know that you're guilty because only you called your roommate and you asked for a lawyer, and only guilty people ask for lawyers. So another interrogation ensued on Monday. On that Monday, it was a long one, but this time I'm like a starving dog out in the street that sometimes cruel kids will kick and whatever. That's how they were kicking me, because I was already mentally drained. They said, we think you weren't truthful. We think you were the lookout for your roommate. So now there's another statement that they want me to say of my roommate, that I was the lookout for my roommate. It was on tape. It went, for them, it went pretty well because it was basically the same statement, but when we be from Friday, so it was not. But then but they weren't satisfied. Lie detector test, which that's not a lie detector test. We all know that now. But they say, well, you're being deception. You're not telling the truth. You're going to get the death penalty. The death penalty was never off the table. They wanted it. They said, if you don't cooperate, you're going to get the death penalty. So at that point, they were saying, hey, we think you were in there committing a crime with your roommate. So and at this point, I just want to get it over with. I just want to get to a judge or to a lawyer or whatever I have to. So, but they're taping this. This is a taped statement. But as they're asking me these questions, they're asking me, when you walked in this restaurant, did you see this item? I would say yes, and they would look at their notes, they would stop the tape. No, you couldn't have seen that. Oh, okay, I didn't see it. So they would rewind it, or they would ask me the color of an item. Did you see this, what color it was? And I would I didn't know. I guess it took me like five colors of the spectrum. It took me a while, and then would stop the tape and rewind it. And at some point, they got upset. One of the detectives, the good cop, got off of his chair and he threw it at me, right at my head. And I sort of ducked and he caught it. He almost hit me on the head. And so at that point, the other detective, the bad one, I guess they both were bad. And they, we're gonna do it easier. We're gonna type it. So again, this statement was their statement. They were telling me what to say. I was guessing. And then once they had that statement, I signed it. I didn't know what I was signing. I didn't know what, I just wanted it over with. Then that night, they took me to jail. And then that started my process. That's how I started down this nightmare. That was the first couple of days.
Wow. You know, it's interesting because I worked in Austin for 5 years, and I covered the case of the yogurt shop murders of these 4 girls that were killed in an Austin yogurt shop, and they coerced confessions, same thing that you're telling me, out of 4 suspects that eventually all got off because their confessions were coerced. I think at one point they even held a gun to the guy's head. So how often does this sort of thing happen, Mike? I mean, because you hear of Brady violations, you hear of bad lineups, you hear of coerced confessions, you hear of bad witnesses. How often do you think this really happens in our criminal justice system?
Well, I think more frequently than people understand. I think it's usually justified. I mean, the attempt to be justified is, well, that's the means we have to use to get to the end that we need to reach. And the only times that it really comes to light that this was, that you have a false confession or a mistaken eyewitness identification, that 9 times out of 10 is due to the way the photo spreads are presented to the witnesses, or these other reasons that are the apparent reason for wrongful convictions. At the root of most of them is some form of police or prosecutorial misconduct. And it emerges or manifests itself as a mistaken eyewitness identification. But then once that person, say, is exonerated through DNA, and you realize that it's a mistaken eyewitness identification, and you go back and investigate, as we did in a recent case out of Harris County, you learned the police told them who to pick. So it's not really mistaken eyewitness identification so much as it is police misconduct. And I think it happens more frequently than we realize because we only identify it when we're able to exonerate somebody and prove that they were innocent to begin with.
Wow. And I know that DPD actually changed the way they were doing lineups because of that very thing.
Well, the Innocence Project of Texas went to the legislature and changed the law so that they were required to do that. But yeah, actually, while we were in, when I was in the Conviction Integrity Unit, even before they were required to change it by law, we had so many DNA exonerations that we could trace back to the bad way the photo spreads were conducted that they changed it on their own even before they were required to by law.
Wow. With so many so many wrongfully convicted people on so many cases, I'm sure you get probably thousands of requests from inmates. How do you choose which cases to pick?
So every year we get maybe 10,000 letters, and those letters turn to approximately 2,000 new applications. And this is just the office in New York City. We have, dozens upon dozens network organizations statewide. And for New York, our mandate is limited to DNA. And so that limits the pool even further. And so of those 2,000 applications, presently we have, I'm going to give you the exact number, 3,520 people who are waiting in our queue just for us to intake their case. This is just to reach out, get the documentary evidence necessary to be able to do a fulsome review before it's recommended to our post-conviction litigation department. Every year, given our capacity, we have the opportunity to evaluate about 2,000 cases through our triage system, and at the end of it, only about 50 of those cases That's around 2% of the cases that we get each year that we're able to, given our capacity, recommend to our lawyers. We're hoping to expand that amount, but it's a very small percentage. And in terms of that assessment, it depends. The Innocence Project will engage in a fulsome review, even through our intake process. We'll review transcripts. Every one of our assessments starts with a application filled out by the individual, police documents, logs, interrogation tapes if they exist. And because our mandate is limited to DNA, we often look for biological evidence presented. But as Mike alluded, those are the rarest of cases. And when we did essentially a postmortem of those cases that we had to close during our queue between 2004 and 2015, 1/3 of those cases were closed because we could not find the DNA. And so imagine the number of people. And so it's that very limited pool eventually that just have the prospect of us taking on their case. Right now, we have about 200 active cases that our staff attorneys are working on.
Chris, it must have been so frustrating to sit there in that prison cell knowing you're innocent and wanting someone to believe you. How did you find out about the Innocence Project, and how did you convince them to take your case?
While I was in prison, I ran across Time magazine, and I read an article on attorney Barry Scheck, who started the Innocence Project, and I had seen he was, I think he was already getting people exonerated, the Innocence Project, and in my mind, I thought, well, I wish somebody would listen to me, because, you're in there, you're invisible, pretty much, to society. But anyway, I saw that, and what happened, maybe a year or two later, there was a Austin detective and a Texas Ranger that came to visit me. And they at this time, but I'm now 20, I'm 30 years old now, I'm older. I've taken some college classes, some psychology classes. I'm kind of like armed for what they're, but when they came to ask me about the same crime. And usually detectives don't go see people for the same crime, they go see them for other crimes. And in my mind, I said, there's a reason why these guys but I didn't say anything, I just said, okay. So before they started their interrogation or interview, because I didn't let it become an interrogation on that one, I asked the Austin detective, like, wait a minute, let me ask you a question. What if I get a hold of Barry Scheck? His reaction was immediate, don't do that, it's gonna make me look more guilty. I didn't say anything, but wait a minute, they're hiding something there, because I knew enough about the Innocence Project that they leave no stone unturned, but I didn't say anything. I didn't want to tell them I was innocent because I had seen the Shawshank Redemption, and I know how that turned out. So I didn't want them to think, because then they'll destroy evidence, or they go destroy any kind of evidence they have, if they have any. So I essentially they wanted me to identify, they showed me in a photo lineup, 3 of them. In one of them I recognized myself, and the other one I recognized my roommate, but then they gave me another one that I couldn't recognize anybody. Apparently the actual perpetrator, of this crime had been, I think these detectives had come to see me in 1998, somewhere like that. And the real perpetrator had been writing letters they wrote letters to the Austin American Statesman, to the DA's office, to Governor Bush, to anybody who would listen, that he was the one that did it and nobody else. But everybody ignored those letters. They didn't. So not until 98, these cops, somebody told the law enforcement to look into this. But apparently when they went to see me, they were trying to establish a link between all 3 of us. But there was no links to be made, because so at any rate, I said, you know what? And the DA's office made a big deal of it in the media, saying that while he admitted that he was guilty even the second time, the reason I told him I'm guilty, I did the crime, just let me do my time, not because I was guilty, because I didn't want him to go destroy anything. So look, threw him off. I went and talked to my roommate, no, not a roommate, to somebody who was going, one of my acquaintances in prison that was leaving on parole. I asked him, I didn't tell him all the details, but I asked him if we could contact the New York Innocence Project or Barry Scheck, find him on the computer somewhere. Because I knew about computers, even though we were like out of touch, but we knew about them. And he did reach out to the Innocence Project in New York, and unfortunately, like Bhavan said, probably a lot of intake. So, so they recommended, they sent him a list of the Innocence Projects. And at that time, there was only 12 of them in the country. Texas, unfortunately, didn't have one. So for some reason, I reached out to University of Wisconsin Law School. I wrote them, and I told them everything I've told the public, and they took my case. And then that started the...
Wow, that's awesome. Mike, how long does it take to, you think, on average, get a case through? And what all do you have to do? I mean, there's obviously the DNA testing can take forever. We know there's backlogs in that. On average, how long does it take? And what's the science behind getting some of these people out of jail?
Well, first off, I think Chris makes an excellent point in that what all he had to go through to be exonerated, and how, in some ways, fortunate that things fell into place. I mean, what are the odds? So, to me, that's an indication that for every person exonerated, there are probably another 50 innocent people who are never exonerated, who the odds don't fall in their favor. But as far as how long it takes, it's a very lengthy process. I think somebody figured out that, there's an average of, 7 or 8 years, whatever. I mean, you've got to gather all the evidence. You've got to read the trial transcripts. You've got to read all the paperwork. You've got to make a determination whether this case even has a chance or not, and to move forward with it. And then, of course, it's trying to find perhaps biological material from whatever, 15, 20 years ago. Sometimes we do. And then it's figuring out the best way. DNA technology has advanced along with all other science, and figuring out the best way to test, the best kinds of tests to use, and getting that done. And then everything's got to fall into place. And then sometimes you're meeting active resistance from the prosecutors, and active resistance even from the judge. And so that can drastically slow down the process. And then sometimes the cases will sit at the Court of Criminal Appeals for years, and because they make the ultimate decision. I mean, we had a case that we went through fairly quickly out of Harris County, and it was a murder case. It was a horrible murder case. There was 6 eyewitnesses that say they saw our client, Lydell Grant, commit this murder in the parking lot of a nightclub in Houston. I mean, they didn't know him, but it's a long story how he was mistakenly identified. But the police went back and they suspected Lydell Grant, so they got the 6 eyewitnesses to pick his picture. But it looked very impressive when you come to trial. 6 eyewitnesses. Yeah. Well, they're all picking his picture. They all pick him out because the police told them to, the same police officer. Wow. And we were able to get him exonerated. We were able to not only prove it wasn't him through DNA, through the CODIS database, we were able to prove who the perpetrator was. And then the Houston police found the perpetrator in Atlanta. He gave a full confession on tape in 2 hours. The Court of Criminal Appeals sent that case back 2 times and sat on it 1.5 years before they exonerated him.
That's infuriating.
And the Harris County Police Department, by the time, our DA's office, by the time the actual perpetrator confessed, even they agreed he should be exonerated. So a lot of it's beyond our control, but it can take years and years. In a lot of cases, there's no good reason for it to take that long.
Well, this isn't one of the questions on here, but now I'm curious. Do y'all ever prosecute police officers or prosecutors for lying and doing what they do and putting innocent people in jail? I mean, what are the ramifications and how do you hold them accountable?
Well, that's a really an excellent question. Of course, you know, I don't have the power to prosecute anybody, but what we can do and have done and have worked with the New York Innocence Project closely with is filing grievances with the Texas Bar on prosecutors who've been caught suborning perjury and stuff. Now, if I suborn perjury, I do get prosecuted. If they suborn perjury, then we've got the state bar to make a complaint to. And actually, Nina Morrison from New York helped us in the most recent case. She's now a federal district judge. But these two prosecutors in Bell County got caught, in our case, suborning perjury from their key witness. And the Court of Criminal Appeals called them out on it, and we successfully got them disciplined.
And what about cops? Do you ever see them?
Well, there's really, go ahead.
I wanted to say something to the effect about police officers. I know that in my case, I think the Texas Rangers, after the fact, I think the Rangers or somebody, they did a full police report investigation, and they found out my civil rights were violated. So I think they sent them up. I think they sent it to the FBI for prosecution. But I think the Department of Justice said, well, statute of limitations is run, so they couldn't do anything.
Do they get support? I know that there is some money that they get after, that some of the exonerees do get after they're exonerated. How do you help them get back on their feet after this horrifying event in their life?
When we talk about the 70 network organizations, the capacity and the ability to do work sort of varies across the board in New York. We're fortunate we have a social work department. And our social work department, often with our exonerees, you know, I'll give you some numbers. Mike alluded to this earlier, but often the data that we collect or the factors that we know that contributed to wrongful convictions are a result of doing essentially an autopsy on the known cases of wrongful conviction. And we haven't said this yet, but the National Registry of Exonerations in the U.S., it accounts for known cases of wrongful convictions. And as of this morning, in anticipation of today's talk, I was like, let me see what the numbers are. Currently, there's 3,299 wrongful convictions that were overturned. And collectively, those individuals have served over 30,000 years. 30,000 years. And the average age of someone going in and being convicted is 27 years old. The average age of them coming out is 44 years old. So it's a lifetime. And Chris and I were talking about this earlier. The needs that are anticipated vary across the board. And so for our social work department, they're helping folks with getting IDs, getting their social security number, securing employment, finding a place to live, but also, heartbreaking, trying to find family members that they have lost contact with as a result of this experience of wrongful conviction. And when it comes to compensation, it also varies across the board. There's now 37 states that have compensation, but it's so varied in the way that it's issued. And oftentimes, it's not uniform. It's grossly underfunded. There's individuals that don't get social services, and it varies in the sense that if there are certain states where if you've contributed, and I use that word loosely, contributed to your wrongful conviction either through pleading guilty or confessing falsely, despite the fact that DNA evidence has unequivocally shown that you were wrongfully convicted, you may not be eligible for compensation. If you are no longer incarcerated, there are certain states that even though you want an opportunity, you will not have an opportunity to be compensated if you are exonerated after the fact. There are states where if you were convicted of something prior to being wrongfully convicted, and I actually had a colleague share with me, she had a client where he had stolen a bicycle, and a few years later, and this was at the age of 18, he was then wrongfully convicted for something else, served over 30 years, and after the fact, he was not able to be compensated as a result of that prior conviction. And so compensation, the variance is gross. It's often a political campaign in terms of what pressures are imposed, and there's no guarantee.
When I hear about these cases, I often hear it's been 25, 30 years that some people have spent in prison, so we think this happened way long time ago. Do you think there's been enough criminal justice reform that some of these things have changed or is still happening? Because then I listened to that Serial podcast where you had the case of Adnan Syed, and they had other suspects in the case that they never even pursued and just basically put that on him, and then now he's out and he's free. So, I mean, do you think there's been criminal justice reform, or do you think there's still so much of this going on? I'll leave that to...
There's been criminal justice reform, we're active every legislative session and work with New York. They provide resources and assistance for us at the Texas legislature. But in so many cases, it really is, it doesn't get at the root of the wrongful convictions. I mean, if you look at it analytically, I think, how does this happen? I mean, someone's completely innocent in the fact that they didn't do it, or in some cases, no crime was ever committed. People get convicted of a crime, and it turns out there was no crime. That happens in some arson cases and other kinds where they later determine it wasn't even arson. So what is it about these people who are wrongfully convicted, and you start trying to analyze the demographic, and so much of it is they are of a demographic, of a religion, of a race, of a ethnicity that the people in power disfavor and are looking for a way to get rid of. I believe, because what other explanation is there for these people who have been wrongfully convicted who share this in common? And there couldn't be any real evidence to convict them because they're innocent. So why were they? And why do they all have this, so many of them have this in common, that they are some sort of disfavored minority?
Chris, I just have to ask, what did it feel like to finally that somebody believed you and that you were cleared and you walked out those prison doors? Tell me what you felt when you first learned that you were getting out.
Well, the first, when I got a call from my Innocence Project attorney, said, ran the DNA, now we know you're innocent. So that DA was on board, so I was like really happy that even just the fact when the Wisconsin Innocence Project called me, or the Innocence Project, they didn't exactly say they're taking my cases, just started asking me more questions. So in here, that felt great. Somebody is finally listening to me. The release was, I was happy, but so much had changed. Talking to Bhavan, at that time, I was walking down. I just walked out of the courtroom. I just walked into one of my the Innocence Project team wanted me to talk to a reporter in Minnesota. And as I'm walking down across the Texas Capitol, and I'm like, "What? How? Are we gonna get to a phone or what?" No, he pulled out a cell phone. So I was like, that was kind of like jarring. I went to the restroom. Toilets flushed by themselves. I had no idea. So that kind of, but you get released. It's great, but at some point, I was left with picking up the pieces, And I had to figure out how to get this puzzle back together. And that's the hard part. It's that it doesn't end for us. I mean, even now, I went to law school, I practice law, or I practice law, or do what I do. And people look at us exonerees. Most of us but a lot of us, even the ones that we have gone on to careers, we're still hurting inside. It's something that I deal with pretty regular, not as often, but it's still there. But it was. I'm very fortunate, like Mike said, and real quickly, just addressing the DNA. At that time, when I was going through my the post-conviction, while I was in prison, during that time in the late '90s, DNA evidence or the forensic evidence was routinely thrown away because there was no storage. I guess that was their rationale. But in my case, for my attorney said, you know what, you're very lucky that there was still some samples to test the DNA, because it seemed they had thrown away all the samples on that shelf, and it seemed like it was in a corner where they didn't get to it. It was like a little angel. But yes, it was bittersweet, but it was a bittersweet moment, I guess.
And I guess too, like Mike, for you, it must feel somewhat like a calling. How do you feel when you get someone out? I mean, how does that feel for you personally? And Bhavan, the same thing for you.
Well, it's what makes the work so rewarding, because there are so many disappointments. And, I mean, it's a great feeling, but as Chris put it, I mean, it's bittersweet too, because, you're usually looking at someone who's spent the better part of their life locked up for something they didn't do, and certainly being able to be exonerated is some justice for them, and it's a good feeling. But at the same time, there's another side to that coin.
I'd agree, and the only thing I'd add is, yes, it's bittersweet, and it's a good feeling. And then the next day you turn to the next case, because there's thousands waiting.
Well, I applaud you all for the work that you do. That's amazing. Thank you.
Thank you.
They deserve it.
Thank you.
Okay, so now we're going to go to a couple of questions that the audience is asking, and the first question is, does public attention on a case impact the exoneration process, thinking specifically of the Adnan Syed case that was mentioned? Because there was a lot of pressure from that podcast on that case. Do you think that helped? Anyone that wants to take that?
I can take that. Absolutely. It is the way that we often ask the public to help us with our work. If you go on our website, innocenceproject.org/get involved, oftentimes the calls to action are to the public to speak about this, to tweet about it, to talk about it, to call their legislator, to make the public aware that this is happening. And not only does it impact exonerations, it also has a profound impact on the policies that are passed as a result.
I want to add on that. The Melissa Lucio is, where I'm sure in Texas everybody's familiar with the Melissa Lucio case. Mm-hmm. And the way I was scrolling, or I was looking at my Instagram, mm-hmm. and I saw a post on Melissa Lucio, mm-hmm. and I read it, and it really infuriated me what she's gone through. And I reached out to the person that posted it, and I asked how I could help. So he put me in contact with a producer of that documentary on Melissa Lucio. Mm-hmm. And when I talked to her, she kind of picked my brain, what can she do? And from what I'm aware of, At that point, Melissa Lucille's chances of in the courts were dimming. And what I told her, basically, what like Bhavan said, you're gonna have to make this viral. Blast it on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, celebrity, whatever you have to put pressure. At that point, I think it was more of the political pressure on Governor Abbott. That's the only way he's gonna, but fortunately, the court stepped in. But political pressure, pressure from the public, whatever we can do, we have the tools, but it takes a village, as they say, right?
So many times the people in power seem to not really care about justice. The prosecutor doesn't care about justice. Unfortunately, sometimes the judges seem to not care about justice. We can usually depend on the general public to care about justice.
Yeah, when you see all these podcasts that are now helping exonerate people and people that are doing some of their own research and then obviously teaming up with you guys, that's very telling. Okay, what specific policy changes does the Innocence Project advocate for to improve the accuracy of convictions?
Well, it's across the board. So again, I turn to the data set that we have, the 3,299 people, and their experiences often inform the policy reforms that are pursued. And so when you look at those cases, 70% of those cases involved a factor of eyewitness misidentification. 40% of those cases involved the misapplication of forensic science. 30% of those cases had an aspect of false confession. 17% of those cases had a jailhouse informant. And so often the policy initiatives that are pursued are to try and address those things. I mentioned, or I think Mike did in the beginning, access to post-conviction DNA testing. In '92, when the Innocence Project started, there were no states that had rules around access to post-conviction DNA testing. Now all 50 states do. It's not the same. There's variance in terms of access and how easy it is or how difficult it is, but that's a mark of progress. I referenced earlier 37 states have access to compensation. Again, there's variance, but that's a marker of progress, and it's a direct result of what is needed by our clients that come out. We are pursuing, I'll give you the latest right now just because there's such an abundance, but over the past year, we've helped pass 5 laws banning deception when it comes to juveniles in police interrogations. And what's interesting about that is the general public is shocked when they hear, what, officers can lie during the course of interrogations? They can, and we're having a lot of difficulty trying to pass laws relating to adults, and so we're starting with juveniles in an effort to try and bridge that. Laws relating to improving the way that eyewitness evidence is accounted for, laws with respect to jailhouse informants, laws in relation to recording interrogations in an effort to have some record of what is happening. And so it really is across the board, and we work with our network organizations. What I will say is the 3 sort of broad categories that we pursue is laws to try and reveal wrongful convictions, so things to make it a little bit easier for innocence organizations to do their work, laws to prevent wrongful convictions from happening in the first place. I know one of the things that we're pursuing right now is an effort to prevent the trial penalty, and I know Chris can talk about that. But also laws to assist with what happens after the fact. Compensation, social benefits, ensuring large sweeping rules to ensure that this doesn't happen to the general public. And at the essence of this, I think what I've taken away from my experience in doing this work is anyone can be wrongfully convicted. So these law reforms that are being pursued are not just for individuals who are or who have been, they are for the benefit for the entire populace.
The next question is, what percentage of wrongful conviction cases involve people of color? Is race a factor? And I mean, I don't know, but a lot of the cases I've covered have been African-American men.
I mean, that was our experience in Dallas for sure, and that's borne out nationwide with the statistics. I mean, it's very difficult to measure. I mean, so many. I mean, we're a country, as everybody knows by now, of mass incarceration. Certainly, African American men are convicted at a higher rate than majority populations. And so it stands to reason that a lot more of them are wrongfully convicted. But it's hard to measure because the only real barometer you have are people who are exonerated, and that represents a very small percentage of a totally unknown statistics. How many people are actually wrongfully convicted in the first place?
Does DNA work? Does the DNA work the Innocence Project does help convict the real perpetrator? And I have seen that happen, I believe.
In the Lydell Grant case, I just mentioned it actually did. And when our cases in Dallas, we had a number of cases that we went back and were able to exonerate the innocent person and identify, in some cases, prosecute the actual perpetrator. There was one case that was particularly infuriating that, it was Gary Udishin's case, who's our former president here, Patrick Waller, where he was the very first person in Dallas County to ask for a DNA, post-conviction DNA testing after the statute was passed in 2001. The DA's office at that time, this is before Craig Watkins, fought it successfully to prevent Patrick from getting a DNA test. The statute was amended. Patrick filed another motion. Gary filed it for him. Once again, the DA's office fought testing and successfully, so he didn't get a DNA test. When Craig came into office and we went over there, we started looking at all the cases of individuals who had asked for DNA testing and had been turned down, and to see if they should have gotten it. Patrick's was one of them. And so we agreed to DNA test Patrick's. This was, I don't know, by then, 2007, 2008. And the DNA test not only exonerated him, it identified actually the two perpetrators who committed this crime. But by then, the statute of limitations had run, and we couldn't prosecute them because the former administration had fought the DNA testing. And, of course, they were the ones who were supposedly tough on crime, and and we were the ones who were supposedly being soft on crime.
Well, and it's interesting because really DNA is as good as what is in CODIS. I mean, because there has to be a database to compare it to. And if the real perpetrator never got DNA put into the CODIS system, then you may never catch them, right?
That's true. I could go on and on with stories about where we were able to, but yeah, that's true.
Okay, for Chris, what, if anything, happened to the officers who wrote your false confession?
Nothing. One of them, the actual bad cop, the worst one, he actually, I believe, years after, I think he got caught again, coercing a confession out of somebody, but I think the lawyer or whoever, he got caught and he got fired, or he told him. But at any point, I think he sued the city to get his job back. I think he got fired and the white cop didn't. He was discriminated, something like that. I'm not too clear on the facts, but he came back on the force as a lieutenant. When I started suing, when I was released, the Innocence, the Barry Scheck in his law firm, his civil rights firm, he instituted the lawsuit against Austin. At that point, Austin saw what was coming, so I think they told this guy either retire or you get, because we can't have you when this lawsuit. So he was, but the other guy, the other detective, the other semi, he died of cancer at, I think he was 30-something years old. So, but no, they didn't get it. Nothing happened to them, so.
Have you seen cases where the person who requested help from the Innocence Project ended up being guilty?
We get 100 letters a month. And certainly, they're not all innocent. That's why we go through such an extensive vetting process.
Is there any data on how many people have been wrongly convicted that die in prison or are executed? I mean, do you ever find out after the fact? I feel like there was a case recently where that happened.
What I can say is, I think the data set I can refer to is the 238 cases of the New York Innocence Project, about 10% of those people were sentenced to death. I don't know, Mike, would you have anything to add there?
I think there's, at least two pretty well-known cases in Texas of individuals who are almost certainly innocent who've been executed, specific cases. I've got a case right now in Dallas County, and this guy is innocent, and he's skated one execution date. It's on death row. It's a case that's been covered by NPR, involved some kind of hokey, hypnotically enhanced eyewitness testimony, a lot of prosecutorial misconduct. Yeah, it's an issue.
Get with me after this movie story I like to do. Put them on Channel 8 tomorrow. How can we help the Innocence Project expand its resources and assist more people who have been wrongly convicted?
I think the call to action is sign up so that you can get the alerts on how to help. Oftentimes, we will request the public's help in furthering our law reform efforts. There's opportunities to volunteer. We have fellowships with students. There's opportunities to be engaged in terms of what's happening in your specific jurisdiction. And also, of course, donating to the various network organizations across the board is also helpful.
What can be done to incentivize the criminal justice system to end wrongful convictions?
I'll leave that to you, Mike.
Well, the criminal justice system is such a behemoth. I mean, I think, and of course, this is a very controversial thing now. But I think in the long run, it's going to bear out. I think electing progressive prosecutors is certainly, I mean, the prosecutorial office is the most powerful player in the criminal justice system. They decide who to charge, what to charge, who to plead, who to take to trial, who to seek the death penalty on. That's all absolutely discretionary with them. And the only remedy for the abuse of that power is to, at least in Texas, is to vote the DA out of office if you don't like what they're doing. And so I think progressive prosecutors are certainly an effective way to address that issue.
Chris, you were going to say something.
Well, and this is something that my personal point of view, and going to law school and becoming a lawyer and attending the same law school that these prosecutors do. Law schools, there's no difference in what Mike is learning in law school than a prosecutor, DA in Texas or DA. But I think from my point of view, I think this immunity that prosecutors have, I think is ridiculous. I've heard Supreme Court justices, and for me, I'm going to be a realist. They sit in their ivory towers. They have no idea that, if you don't hold these prosecutors accountable, and the law doesn't hold them accountable, like Mike said, Mike pointed out, a defense attorney suborns perjury, that's his license, probably prison, but a prosecutor or DA, that has got to change. There's no way around it. It's got to change.
Thank you all so much. Thank you for moving mountains and doing what you do, because I know that it is hard work. And can we please give all these wonderful people a round of applause? That definitely deserves a standing ovation, because to give someone their life back is amazing.
Yes, here I am. Oh, my goodness. If you're like me, you're inspired and horrified at the same time, right? But Bhavan and Mike, thank you so much for your incredible work. And Chris, thank you for your courage and resilience. And Rebecca, thanks for your work to expose these kind of cases. If you haven't been through our permanent exhibition, I want to make sure next time go through, or do come, and then if you didn't see it when you came before, go to the Pivot to America wing, and you'll see that we look at the evolution of rights in our country, and one of the strands of content is criminal justice. And so these topics, clearly there needs to be many more upstanders working to bring about criminal justice reform. So thank you all so much for being here. If you didn't get your questions answered, or if you'd like a chance to talk about the Innocence Project's works, our panelists have generously agreed to stay for a little while longer and will be in our classrooms just to the right of the lobby. So if you'd like to go in and ask them a question, they will be in there and our staff will direct you. Thank you all for joining us so much. Become followers of the Innocence Project and start speaking out. Thanks for being here.